Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Monday, May 4th, 2020, and today we're going to be taking a look at the 2020 Senate election in the state of Texas. So Texas has, this dynamic of being a very solid Republican state, but in recent times has narrowed up in both the presidential election and in the United States Senate elections. In 2018, Ted Cruz, the incumbent, ran against Beto O'Rourke, a little-known representative from the state of Texas who visited every single county in the state. I mean, if you look at the state itself, honestly, he put a lot of effort into this race. Now, obviously, it's Texas. It's known for its Republican identity, and it has the largest amount of electoral votes out of any Republican state in the presidential election. So Ted Cruz was pretty popular at the time, nearing a 50% approval rating with low 30s in terms of disapproval rating, and he ended up narrowly defeating Beto O'Rourke in 2018. So, what was different? Well, first of all, Ted Cruz had recently just lost a Republican nomination to now President Donald Trump, and Beto O'Rourke had a lot invested into this race. There was a number of efforts to fundraise on both sides, and it ended up being a very, very close race that pretty much skyrocketed Beto O'Rourke in terms of where he stood with the Democratic Party. In fact, he was a top contender for the 2020 Democratic nomination for a couple of months, polling in third place nationwide until dropping out before the primaries. Now, when you look at the 2018 Senate elections, it was a Republican victory, but the Senate didn't necessarily reflect what we saw in the House. The United States House of Representatives had gains for the Democrats, but the Senate did not. It wasn't exactly a Democratic wave in terms of what we saw in the Senate. The Democrats lost a net 2 seats compared to the Republicans. But if you take a look at 2020, there's a lot more opportunities for the Democrats to have pickups, and Texas seems to be a prime target for some Democrats. However, the dynamic is different. This is not a Democratic wave year, and Texas isn't being focused on as much as it was in 2018. John Cornyn is a mildly popular incumbent with a 44% approval rating, and right now, based off his previous election history, he should be pretty much reelected by a pretty substantial margin. The last time there was a Democratic victory, and he coincided with that in a Senate election year, was 2008, in which John Cornyn reflected roughly what the John McCain margin was in 2008. He got 55% of the vote compared to 43% of the vote in 2008. In 2014, I wouldn't necessarily think this is the best reflection of a Senate race in Texas because it was a Republican wave year, and the same goes for 2018, though the only difference is that 2018 is a lot more recent. But once 2020 comes up, it looks like it's going to be a pretty substantial victory for John Cornyn. It's not just the election history, but if you take a look at the last time there was a presidential election and Texas voted, Texas gave Donald Trump nearly 9% more than Hillary Clinton in 2016. And if you take a look at the number of votes, I mean, it was extremely high in terms of turnout. 2018 almost reflected that in the Senate election in terms of turnout, which is pretty interesting to me. It makes me wonder what 2020's turnout will be like. But in this 2016 presidential election, Donald Trump had a pretty substantial victory. Now, 2018 was the year of a Democratic wave in the United States House of Representatives. The Democrats actually gained 10% more votes than they had in the previous 2016 House elections. In the year that coincided with Hillary Clinton, the Democrats only got 37% of the vote in the United States House compared to 2018 at 47%. Now, Texas has this thing where the Democrats are eventually going to hit a cap. What I mean by that is, there are just so many Republican voters that no matter how hard a Democrat tries, it's going to eventually level off. There will be a peak for the Democrats in the 2020 election. Now, whether that peak ends with a narrow Biden victory in Texas, that's probably a less than 1% chance at that situation, but that'll probably be the highest. If a Democrat was to win in Texas, it would be by a plurality. Now, the problem with that is the Republican Party almost certainly gets a majority in terms of the overall statewide vote. Beto O'Rourke, after visiting every single county and having such a strong campaign behind him, I mean, we've seen the likes comparable to Barack Obama in terms of campaign tactics. Beto O'Rourke turned the state from red to purple practically overnight. Over 2 years, that race became close. And keep in mind, Ted Cruz is more popular than John Cornyn right now. At the fourth quarter approval rating after 2019, that is where it stands, and that's where it stood in 2018. But we have a presidential election year. Donald Trump will be at the top of the ticket, and that will likely lead over some voters to vote for John Cornyn down ballot. Now, If you look at the approval ratings, John Cornyn had a 44% approval rating compared to a 25% disapproval rating. Ted Cruz had a 49% approval rating compared to a 34% disapproval rating, which means that most Texas residents either have no opinion or approve of Ted Cruz, and the same goes for John Cornyn. Now, let's talk about his Democratic opponents. There's two up there, Royce West, who is a current state senator, and the frontrunner, Mary Jennings Hager, and she is a retired United States Air Force major, and she was a nominee for the 31st District in 2018, and that ended up with her losing the race very narrowly, though. So this likely could have been avoided if John Carter had lost that seat, but he ended up winning it, and now she's running for Senate. So when we look at the possibility of a runoff, obviously she is the current frontrunner. And right now, according to a number of pundits, it's rated as a likely Republican state, and Politico is the only one that doesn't have that characterization, in which they have it as a lean Republican state. And I understand that characterization. It's not as close as 2018 was, nor is there nearly as much fundraising for any of the Democrats compared to the Republican incumbent. 18 million 19 million if you round up to 5 million. I mean, it's astronomical what we're seeing for John Cornyn, who in any other year would be easing his way to victory, but the Republican Party is not letting Texas become competitive anytime soon, at least in terms of money. Now, it will be competitive in 2024, more than likely than not, but right now, if you look, John Cornyn is outraising his Democratic opponent practically 4-1 at this point. And if you look at the overall polling data from 2016, you know, Donald Trump led by 12% compared to the actual victory of 9%. So, in fact, the data was mildly incorrect in determining a victory, but Donald Trump did end up winning the state by roughly the same margin. It did overestimate President Trump. Now, this is the one thing that I would say the Republicans should worry about in Texas, not so much in the Senate race, but in the presidential race. If Donald Trump led by 12% and underperformed by 3%, and Trump is only leading by 1.4% now, well, what happens when we hit Election Day? Now, I understand in 2016, there were some time periods where Trump narrowed down to a 3 to 4 point lead in the state of Texas, but never was it this close to a point where Biden or any Democrat at that point had led in any substantial polling firms' polling data. That's just insane that a Democrat's even coming close in the state of Texas, and realistically, this is just because of an overall shift. McCain plus 11.8, and then Romney plus 15.8, and then all of a sudden, we see a 7-point swing from the Democratic Party to the Democratic Party in 2016. And if 2018 showed us anything, that the race could narrow up in both the Senate and House elections. But John Cornyn, I honestly think, is safe. I consider this one a likely Republican state, mainly because the Democratic Party isn't as invested in Texas, and on the presidential level, it likely won't be covered by Joe Biden a lot. Realistically, it could be competitive, but the chances that Joe Biden ends up on top in Texas is very slim. If Joe Biden's winning there, he already has the presidency locked up. So realistically, the Democrats aren't going to focus on Texas. This is not some state that they're neglecting. More so, they're strategizing and using their money better spent. Same thing goes for the United States Senate. Realistically, the Democrats have possible pickups in a number of other states. They have Colorado, they have Arizona, they have North Carolina, they have Maine, but Texas is not one of them. And according to all of the political pundits, compared to 2018, if you actually go all the way down here, I mean, it was considered to be a pretty lean or likely are. It did narrow up on Election Day. I mean, you can see how many polls that Ted Cruz led in. Beto O'Rourke really never got competitive up until Election Day, which one poll he tied in for the first time. And Ted Cruz had led all of them except for one back in September 2018, in which he led in one of them and tied with Ted Cruz. It ended up being a very narrow but sure lean Republican victory for the Democrats, but realistically, I don't think they're being underestimated in Texas. The presidential election, sure, might be closer than 2016. Realistically, Biden is not carrying Texas, and realistically, the Democrats are not carrying Texas in the Senate election. It is very important to the party composition for the Republicans. If they lose Texas, they are losing a number of other states. Don't even worry about the Senate. Worry more so about losing that governor's race in 2 years. But when you look at the Senate race in Texas, the Democrats are probably not going to carry it. And the next time there will be an election for the Senate in Texas will be another presidential election year in 2024. So they only need to hold on to this one for right now. And Democrats probably aren't going to give it a lot of attention. You have a pretty popular incumbent based off his approval to disapproval rating, one who's fundraising compared to the Democrats. I guess you could say 3-1 if you add up the Democrats. And then also you have previous election data adding up. Sure, it's trending Democrat on the presidential level, and maybe that 2018 Senate election might be a little bit different because Ted Cruz had a very strong victory before, but keep in mind, whoa, that's so weird, 2012 voting turnout was lower than 2018. That's insane. But if you look, I mean, it was just, sure, Ted Cruz came close to losing, but that doesn't mean that every Republican is all of a sudden vulnerable. Yes, it could be close in the presidential election. I expect Donald Trump's lead to expand out once Biden stops, or at least pushes a lot more efforts towards the Rust Belt and towards the Sun Belt besides Texas and towards the South compared to Texas. Eventually, his numbers are going to dwindle, and John Cornyn is likely to win his reelection bid by nearing 8 to 10%. Yes, his race will be narrower than 2014. It was a Republican wave year compared to what should be a Democratic wave year based off of current trends. And yes, 8% more Americans want Democrats to control both chambers of Congress than Republicans, but Texas is not the national view. Donald Trump lost the popular vote in 2016, but overwhelmingly won it in the Senate, in the presidential race in Texas. So it should be pretty close in the presidential election, but realistically, I don't think that the Senate race is going to be close whatsoever. The Republican Party has a lot invested in this race. The Democrats don't exactly have the best candidates. There's no Beto O'Rourke on this side. The only candidate I could say come close is Julian Castro or Joaquin Castro, who both have very notable names throughout the United States Senate. But, Beto O'Rourke obviously isn't going to run, and when they were polled against Beto O'Rourke, both of them ended up losing. And Wendy Davis already lost the 2014 governor's race, so that wasn't exactly the best bid for the Democrats. So realistically, if they wanted a chance at winning, they would have had to run Beto O'Rourke, and looking, since the primary's more than likely going to go for MJ Heger, it'll likely be a John Cornyn victory, regardless of who the Democratic nominee is at this point. So that pretty much wraps up this video. But I do think that this race should just be looked into a little bit more. I will make a reanalysis once we actually have the nominees and just see if there's any media attention towards the Senate race in Texas. But realistically, the Democrats have their eyes set elsewhere. So again, thank you guys for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you all tomorrow.